Stephen threw a rock down into Bottomless Pit. The visitors counted while it skipped and clattered down into the darkness. It always took quite a while for the sound to die away, but no one ever heard the rock splash into water below or land on a stony bottom. No one knew how deep the pit really was. Bottomless Pit was much too wide to jump, and Stephen could see no way down its deep sides. But on the other side of the chasm, the passageway continued. It headed up a gentle slope, then over a rise and out of sight. Stephen often gazed across the opening, wondering what was on the other side. He had a great urge to explore more of Mammoth Cave. Bottomless Pit was uncrossable for now, but he had another spot in mind. On Sundays, most slaves were allowed to rest from their labors. Those who wished could attend church and listen to Sunday service from the back of the room. Others cultivated their garden plots or went hunting in the woods. Squirrel, woodchuck, and rabbit made a welcome addition to the bacon, cornmeal, and molasses the slaves were given to eat. Stephen sometimes went swimming in Green River, which was down the hill from Mammoth Cave, or he walked the long miles to Glasgow to see his mother and brother. But this Sunday he had a different plan. He asked Nita for some cornbread and beans for his lunch, filled a lantern with oil, and took plenty of matches. Then, all by himself, he slipped off to the cave. By now the trails were easy for him. Stephen moved briskly down the grand gallery. He kept the lantern light very low, just bright enough that he wouldn't trip over a rock. He had never been allowed in the cave before, but he wasn't afraid. Somehow he felt welcome in that enormous place. Very soon he reached Steamboat Rock. He passed through the wooden ballroom and the deserted chambers. Just before the bottomless pit lay the object of his quest. Stephen knelt down beside it, his heart beating fast. Right here, a crack in the floor led down to a lower level called the labyrinth. Archibald Miller had taken Stephen this way just once. He had told Stephen that labyrinth means a confusing maze. The tunnels on the lower level turned and twisted. It was easy to get lost, and that was why the tours never came this way. Stephen eased his way down into the narrow opening. He moved carefully. If he dropped the lantern, it might break, and he had no other. It would be a long, dark journey back to the mouth of the cave. He felt like a real explorer, and he was determined not to be afraid. He had the feeling that some thrilling sight was just waiting to be discovered. He wanted to be the one to discover it. He eased down out of the crack and found himself standing in a high, narrow passageway. He tried to remember where Archibald Miller had taken him. In one direction lay Bottomless Pit, but there was no way to cross it on this level either. What was in the other direction? Stephen thought for a moment. He dared not lose his way. Only Nita knew he was in the cave, and she had no idea where he was exploring. If Stephen got lost, no one would know where to find him. He had tucked a few candles in with his lunch. He dug one out and lit it from the lantern flame. Then he stuck it into a crack between the rocks on the floor and watched to see if it would blow out. But this deep inside the cave there was no wind at all. The little flame burned steadily. With it to mark the place where he had entered the labyrinth, Stephen felt safe to explore further. He moved down the tunnel cautiously, making sure to watch the floor in front of him. Now the main tunnel began to branch off in many directions. Stephen ventured a little way down one passageway, but quickly returned. All these rocky pathways looked the same. Now he understood why this place was called the labyrinth. Then he had an idea. He lit another candle stub. This time he used the smoke from the candle flame to burn a crude arrow onto the wall of the cave. It pointed back the way he had come. As long as he marked his way back, he would be safe. He went on, holding his lantern high. The tunnels twisted and turned, but Stephen kept to as straight a path as he could manage. At each intersection, he was careful to smoke an arrow pointing back along his trail. He came to a place where a dome rose overhead and remembered that Archibald Miller had shown this to him. Beyond the dome, a steep slope rose up in front of them, and they had decided to turn back. Now Stephen took another look at this slope. He held his lantern high and walked back and forth. He thought he could see a shadow just under the ceiling. Was there another passageway up above? Stephen set down his lantern and tried to scramble up the steep slope. The rock was very slippery, and he quickly slid back down. The second time he looked for handholds and footholds. He climbed part way up, but had to give up when there was nothing else to grab on the smooth wall. He wouldn't give up. There was another passage up there. He could feel it. Once again he started up, moving crab-like back and forth across the slippery slope. Slowly, slowly he climbed. The lantern light cast strange, wavering shadows on the wall. This time Stephen was successful, and he was rewarded, for there was another passageway ahead of him. Stephen's lantern still burned down below. He dared not try to climb up here with it. It could easily break. So he pulled out his last candle stub and lit it. It gave a meager light. Stephen peered into the darkness. He moved forward slowly, making sure that the candle lit the ground ahead of him. There might be cracks or holes in the floor. Soon he was glad of his caution. He came to a shallow pit. He might have broken his leg if he had walked into it. Then he would have been trapped, maybe to be discovered someday just like Fawn Hoof. He slid carefully down into the pit. There was an opening in the right-hand wall, almost like a window. Stephen thrust his candle into the blackness. What he saw made his eyes widen. He was looking into a huge vertical shaft. It was like looking up into a wide, rocky tunnel. Stephen's light was not bright enough to show either a roof or a floor, but straight across from him was a beautiful sight. Most of the walls in Mammoth Cave were of gray stone, but this shaftway was beautifully colored. It looked as though an enormous yellow and white candle had melted down the curved walls. Streaks of red and black added even more color. Water dripped across the wall from some unseen source overhead. The wet rock gleamed in the dim light from Stephen's candle. Stephen was thrilled. Was he the first person ever to see this sight? He would not be the last, that was certain. It had not been so difficult to get here from the upper level. Ladders could be built at the steepest parts of the trail so that other visitors could make the journey. He headed home to tell Mr. Gorin that his cave held a wonderful new tourist attraction.